We're at Paynes Creek Historical State Park today. This park commemorates the attack and destruction of the Kennedy trading post in 1849 by Seminole Indians. This explains the 3 Seminole Wars from 1842 to 1849. There had been no significant attacks by either side. However, this spot we're on now is very near the actual Kennedy Darling store trading post, and it marked the northern border of what had been left of the Seminoles after the Second Seminole War. This was one of the events that sparked the Third Seminole War. Well, I should probably mention who these guys are. These are not related to this particular battle or even this particular time frame, but these are Seminole commanders. This is Wildcat, and these are the American names: Powell, Osceola, rather. Coacochi. Is that one, the first one's name? And this is Alligator. And I would completely butcher his Indian name, so I won't even bother. This is a drawing of Billy Bowlegs, from a famous photograph. This is Billy Bowlegs II, and I just recently learned that Billy Bowlegs III is buried in near Ortona, in the Ortona Cemetery. So I'm going to check that out eventually. This is really interesting because this shows the series of forts that were built not long after this attack to protect the frontier. Fort Hammer, Crawford, Massacre, Green, Chokonikla, which is the site of where we're on now. We're yards from this site, which was built after this attack on this site. Meade, Clinch, Arbuckle, Kissimmee, Drum, Vinton, Capron, Pierce, Jupiter, etc., etc. Fort Dallas. Down near Miami. Fort Delaney over here. I recently talked to Sean who has done some really interesting photography and study down there in that area, Fort Dallas, and knows a lot about that area. I'd love to get down there someday and see some of those things that he's seen and photographed. This is they call this a museum, and essentially this, I guess, is what makes it a museum. There's some interpretive displays, but these are all things that were excavated from the fort years after it was abandoned, of course. I'm going to try to use this map to explain, but if we think of the three, this is the southern part of Florida, but if we think of the Seminole Wars in terms of geography, the first was on the very northern part of the state. The second, the Indians were basically pushed down into the middle part of the state, central, and then after that they were pushed down even further, and this is what they're calling Indian Territory here. And a lot of this would have been prime land. They just wouldn't have been an area that the Europeans wanted yet. Once the Europeans had moved to these areas and the Indian attacks were no longer a threat, then they would have come down, moved down, and basically moved the Indians out again, which is essentially what they did. However, could never exterminate anyone entirely, and Seminoles remained in the Everglades and prospered, proliferated, and now own a lot of casinos. This shows, and they're calling this murder. I usually agree with extremism, but I think that's more extreme than it needs to be. This is an attack on on this trading post that they saw as invasion into their lands. The fact that a lot of the others didn't necessarily want to have a part in these attacks doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't legitimate attacks. So it is what it is. This is some Seminole dressing. I don't know how they dress in such hot clothes, but okay. It says the clothing worn by Seminole men reflected the influence of Scottish Highlanders who had migrated to Georgia frontier in an earlier time. And that kind of makes sense. I never even thought of it in that way. Oh, here's another. This is interesting. I read this earlier. The Third Seminole War was sparked after a military patrol exploring the Big Cypress Swamp was attacked by 30 Indians led by Billy Bowlegs. The patrol had visited Bowlegs' deserted village 2 days before. He was angered to discover that they had destroyed his banana plants and carried away several bunches of bananas. Now, that's real nice and sweet, but I've read accounts, and I've been on that site where his village was, and I've read accounts where they just completely obliterated it. It wasn't like they ran off with a couple of bananas and banana plants. They burned the shit to the ground, from what I understand from other accounts. So that source is a little, and this site is probably a little older than recent discoveries and things have made it more clear as to what really did happen. Billy Bowlegs left west, handful of Seminole. Chief Apika, Sam Jones, a stubborn foe of the whites, stayed on. See, there's a good example right there. And that's Sam Jones. He's the guy who they have a big, huge statue of him on top of a big, huge hill down at the Big Cypress Indian Reservation. Really, really cool. They won't let you get anywhere near it, but you see it from a distance. It's really pretty neat. I'd love to get up and photograph it. During the military campaign against the Seminoles, soldiers were Seminole was not Indians aboard of mental illness. That's been that way from every war from the beginning of man. It's always, the grunt soldier always has to sit around and wait. A couple of hours of sheer terror followed by months and months of doing absolutely nothing. These are peace talks. This is a photograph, or the painting of the peace talks that went on shortly after this attack. And of course, the U.S. used the attack as an excuse to demand further evacuation, if you will, of the Seminoles. The snowflakes will cry and moan about how the Indians were treated. And yet at the end of the day, we could have just come in and obliterated every single one of them without peace talks, without any kind of consideration. We'd lost some of our men, but we didn't do that. We tried to negotiate removal, etc. You can view that as you like, but it still could have been total annihilation. The actual genocide that people talk about that never actually occurred. There were, in every dealings with the Indians, there were always a way out. There was always peace talks. There was always trying to get them to peacefully surrender.